A black man forced from first class for a white passenger, despite paying in full. Does silence equal acceptance? What happens when this injustice is caught on video? When dignity is denied, how will he respond? If you enjoy this story, don't forget to like and subscribe to H2 Black Thread. Hartsfield-Jackson Atlanta International Airport pulsed with the usual rhythm of late evening travelers, voices over intercoms, the hum of luggage wheels on tile, and the quiet fatigue that settles into terminals after dark. Malik Spencer rolled his carry-on down Concourse B, moving with the kind of practiced calm that came from decades of business travel. A black hoodie under a slate-gray sport coat, jeans clean but not pressed, and sneakers that had seen both boardrooms and bus stops. He wasn't dressed to impress, just to get home. Flight 729 to Denver was boarding. First class. Seat 1A. Window seat. A small comfort after 3 long days of speaking at the Tech and Equity Summit downtown. Malik had delivered a panel on algorithmic bias in hiring platforms, tight audience, engaged questions, even a few hands shaken afterward. But now, all he wanted was silence. He hadn't eaten since noon and his mind drifted to the leftover ribs waiting in his fridge at home. Just a seat and a few hours of peace. That's all. He settled into 1A and opened his phone. A few work emails. A text from his son about the school basketball tryouts. Then, a shadow. "Excuse me, Mr. Spencer." A flight attendant, blonde hair tied tight, leaned slightly toward him with a carefully measured smile. "We were wondering if you'd be willing to switch seats with another guest. He's one of our Platinum Elite members, currently seated near the back." Malik looked up, blinking. "I'm sorry." "Switch seats?" She kept her tone light. "Yes, just a small request. He was expecting a first-class upgrade and it seems there was a mix-up." He nodded slowly, understanding now. "I appreciate you asking," he said, his voice calm, "but I paid for this seat. I'd prefer to stay." The smile faltered just slightly. "Of course. I'll let the team know." He thought that was the end of it. It wasn't. 5 minutes later, a second attendant approached, this one older, voice more clipped. "Mr. Spencer, we understand you declined the earlier request. Unfortunately, due to company policy, we're going to need you to relocate. The passenger in question is among our highest-tier loyalty members." Malik sat still. "I booked this seat, paid for it in full. This wasn't a courtesy upgrade. I'm not moving." The attendant pressed her lips together, offered a tight nod, and left. 2 minutes later, the third wave came. A uniformed supervisor with a clipboard and no pretense of friendliness. "Mr. Spencer, please gather your belongings. You've been reassigned to row 26, seat B." No discussion. No eye contact. He stood up slowly. Every motion felt watched. The walk to the back of the plane stretched longer than it should have. Some passengers averted their eyes. Others stared. No one spoke. Row 26. Middle seat. One armrest already claimed, the other sticky. No apology, just protocol. Behind him, a teenage girl in a window seat lifted her phone quietly. The red light blinked on. Malik Spencer had never thought of himself as someone who drew attention. At 46, with sharp features, a shaved head, and eyes that held a quiet, observant power, he was accustomed to moving through the world largely unnoticed, comfortable in boardrooms, even more comfortable behind the scenes. He preferred it that way. Recognition was fleeting. Stability was not. He'd started out as a software engineer 2 decades earlier, coding long nights in cramped apartments, jumping from contract to contract across the country, earning his stripes the hard way. But after years of proving his value to others, he now consulted for startups on equity and inclusion. It was meaningful work, challenging and exhausting in equal measure. He had just wrapped up 3 intense days at the Tech and Equity Summit in downtown Atlanta, guiding tense conversations about fairness in technology and trying to inspire action where apathy usually thrived. But now Malik wasn't thinking about tech, equity, or any kind of politics. He was drained. More than anything, he wanted to be home in Denver, back with his family. He imagined his 2 kids asleep by now, his wife likely curled up on the couch waiting for him, fighting sleep until she heard him walk through the door. His heart eased slightly at the thought. Seat 1A hadn't been vanity. It had been a small, personal reward for a job well done, a token comfort at the end of a tiring trip. He wasn't seeking validation or privilege, just rest. Peace. A few quiet hours to decompress and shake off the feeling that he was always proving himself, always explaining his presence, even when he belonged. As Malik sat squeezed into the middle seat of row 26, the reality sank in that rest wouldn't come easily tonight. He took a deep breath and shut his eyes, hoping to tune out the murmuring around him, but the injustice lingered. The weight of a familiar discomfort pressed against him, the same exhausting reminder that his rightful place in the world always seemed negotiable. All he had wanted tonight was to get home, unnoticed and unbothered. But Malik realized quietly to himself that the choice had just been taken from him. Malik shut his eyes tighter, trying to drown out the hum of the engines and the whispers around him. But his mind wouldn't quiet. Instead, memories drifted up, sharp and clear, bringing him back to a time when he was younger, less certain, and often invisible. 20 years ago, he'd sat in rooms filled with polite smiles and carefully chosen words. "We appreciate your enthusiasm, Malik, but you're not quite the right fit." Early on, he tried to decode those words, second-guessing his skills, his clothes, his resume. But over time, the code became painfully clear. It wasn't about his qualifications. It was about him, how he looked, where he came from, the silent assumptions people made. One memory lingered vividly. He traveled to San Francisco with a colleague named James, white, affable, Ivy League educated. They booked their tickets at the same time, same price, same company. At check-in, James was swiftly upgraded to business class, while Malik found himself walking alone to a cramped seat in row 34. James had shrugged it off as luck, laughing easily, oblivious to the sting Malik quietly endured for 5 hours in coach. He'd swallowed it then, chalked it up to chance, even though he knew better. But tonight felt like history cruelly repeating itself, except this time Malik had done everything right. He'd built the credentials, earned the accolades, and paid for the dignity of traveling in peace. Still, none of that seemed enough, not even now after speaking about fairness to a room full of executives. The irony tasted bitter. He thought of his son, Elijah, who was soon headed to college, taking his first solo flights into the world. Malik's heart clenched. What kind of message would Elijah internalize if even his own father couldn't hold onto a seat he'd rightfully earned? Would he, too, someday quietly accept these quiet humiliations as ordinary? As Malik opened his eyes, staring at the darkened seat back ahead of him, a quiet resolve began to stir. He'd endured this silent script for years, but now something felt different. The exhaustion he'd carried all evening hardened slowly into clarity. Maybe it was time to stop pretending this was acceptable. Maybe tonight was the moment it finally changed. Earlier, in seat 1A, Malik had sensed trouble brewing from the moment the second attendant approached him. Still, he'd hoped reason would prevail. The attendant had leaned toward him, her voice low but firm. "Mr. Spencer, we're asking again if you'd reconsider switching seats. We understand the inconvenience and would like to offer you a complimentary drink and a $100 travel voucher." Malik had met her gaze evenly. "I appreciate your offer, but I'm not asking for a favor. I'm asking to keep what I paid for." Her smile tightened. "Sir, it's company policy." "Company policy," Malik echoed, aware of passengers shifting their gazes toward the exchange. Policy to downgrade a customer who already paid for first class. She looked away briefly, unsettled. I'll speak with my supervisor, she said softly, then disappeared toward the front of the cabin. For a moment, Malik believed it might be over, that logic, decency, or even simple embarrassment might stop it. But that hope was quickly dashed. Minutes later, a supervisor arrived. She had a clipboard in hand and eyes that refused to acknowledge Malik's humanity. "Mr. Spencer," she said, blunt and authoritative, "due to seating priorities, your seat has been reassigned. Please gather your belongings. I'll escort you to your new seat in row 26. Malik hesitated, frustration rising hot in his chest. Yet he kept his voice steady. "No consent, no apology." The supervisor's eyes flickered with brief discomfort but hardened immediately. "We appreciate your cooperation," she said, clipped and final. She stepped back, gesturing down the aisle. Malik stood slowly, aware of every set of eyes fixed on him. He pulled his bag quietly from the overhead compartment, feeling the gaze of the passenger who'd been waiting. A polished man with slicked back hair and a neatly pressed suit, confident and entirely unbothered. The man slid smoothly into Malik's vacated seat without a glance or acknowledgement, adjusting his cufflinks as though it were his birthright. Walking down the aisle felt like an eternity. Malik kept his chin high but sensed the humiliation that wrapped silently around him. Passengers either averted their gaze or stared with quiet disbelief. From her window seat in row 25, a 15-year-old named Jordan Lee instinctively lifted her phone. She hadn't planned on filming, but something in Malik's quiet dignity struck her. She captured every detail, the forced politeness, the supervisor's distant expression, the smug ease of the passenger in 1A. Jordan uploaded the video impulsively, her fingers typing out a simple caption beneath it. "Why does he have to move?" She posted it, unaware she'd just ignited something far bigger than herself, Malik, or even Sky Reach Airlines. As Flight 729 reached cruising altitude, the quiet, collective discomfort within the cabin settled like a heavy fog. Passengers exchanged glances, murmurs gently rising like steam from hot pavement after rain. "That wasn't right," whispered a woman to her husband in row 20, barely audible yet perfectly clear. 2 rows ahead, a young man shook his head, glancing toward the front, where the newly seated VIP passenger was being lavished with exaggerated care. Extra pillows, complimentary champagne, and the attentive smiles of flight attendants determined to smooth away any hint of trouble. The cabin crew, practiced and composed, behaved as if nothing unusual had occurred. Meanwhile, Malik shifted awkwardly in row 26. To his left sat a young boy whose persistent cough made him flinch with sympathy every few moments. To his right, a middle-aged man loudly discussed cryptocurrency investments, oblivious to Malik's quiet discomfort. He stared at the seat-back tray, breathing deeply, trying to center himself, but the sting of humiliation lingered. He pulled out his phone to distract himself, noticing an unusual cascade of notifications lighting up his screen. Friends, colleagues, acquaintances, all reaching out urgently. "Yo Malik, bro, you're trending right now." "Hey man, saw the video, you okay?" Confused, Malik clicked on the link a friend sent. The footage was raw, unedited, painfully real. He watched himself calmly yet firmly asserting his right to the seat he'd purchased, the quiet dignity of his refusal juxtaposed sharply against the cold indifference of the airline staff. Beneath it, the caption by Jordan Lee shone starkly. "Why does he have to move?" He stared in disbelief at the rapidly climbing view count, the swelling comments filled with outrage and empathy. Heart racing slightly, Malik realized something profound had shifted during the flight, not just in the airplane's cabin but somewhere far beyond its metal walls. His story was now out of his hands, echoing louder than any words he could have spoken himself. When Flight 729 finally landed in Denver, Malik felt a wave of relief mingled with lingering unease. Passengers quietly collected their things, avoiding eye contact with him, yet the tension from earlier still hovered in the air. Stepping off the plane into the airport felt surreal. He was both eager to leave it all behind and aware that this was no longer possible. In baggage claim, he stood silently by the conveyor belt, lost in thought, watching luggage roll by with mechanical predictability. Just then, a man in a worn leather jacket approached hesitantly, glancing over his shoulder before speaking. "Hey, I don't want to bother you," the man said softly, eyes sincere but hesitant. "But thank you for not yelling. You made a statement without making a scene." It meant a lot to see that. Malik met the man's gaze, nodding slightly. "I appreciate that," he said quietly, sensing genuine respect in the stranger's eyes. For the first time since boarding, Malik felt seen, not stared at, not watched, but truly seen. Arriving home brought more surprises. His phone vibrated continuously, overflowing with messages. Emails from strangers expressed gratitude for his calm courage, their words blending encouragement and sorrow. His inbox became a mosaic of solidarity and shared frustration, stories of quiet humiliation, experiences he'd long believed were his alone. But among them, one message stopped him cold. It arrived anonymously, from someone who identified herself only as a former flight attendant. "I saw your video. I've done exactly what they did to you. It was company orders. I hated it. I knew it was wrong every time, but I said nothing. I'm sorry." Those words resonated deeply. Malik stared at the screen, considering how easily injustice became routine, how quickly silence transformed complicity into standard procedure. He thought again of his son, stepping into adulthood, entering spaces Malik had spent his life navigating cautiously. Taking a slow breath, Malik placed his phone upright on the kitchen table, opened the camera and hit record. He spoke without planning, without script, just a father, a professional, a tired man facing the quiet truth of his lived experience. "My name's Malik Spencer," he began, voice steady and clear. "By now, you've seen what happened. But this isn't really about airline seats. It's about who's seen and who's erased. It's about dignity and the right to exist quietly in spaces we've earned." He paused briefly, then continued. "I didn't raise my voice, and maybe that surprised people, but sometimes silence speaks louder than shouting. Today, my silence was captured, but how many times has silence gone unnoticed? How many have been quietly erased? That's what we have to think about." Malik ended the video there, simple, real, human, and uploaded it without edits or filters. Within minutes, comments and shares began pouring in, validating a truth long unspoken but deeply felt. Malik closed his eyes, relieved he'd said what needed saying, unsure of what would happen next, but ready to face whatever came. By morning, Malik's video had taken on a life of its own. His quiet words resonated powerfully, spreading through social media and national news outlets, unleashing a storm Sky Reach Airlines never anticipated. In response to the swelling uproar, Sky Reach released a curt, carefully worded statement around noon. "We regret the discomfort experienced by Mr. Spencer during his recent flight. Sky Reach Airlines values all our customers equally." Their attempt at damage control backfired spectacularly. Commenters seized on the airline's weak language instantly. "Discomfort. You downgraded a paying customer mid-flight. Call it what it is. Discrimination," wrote one furious user. Another replied sharply, "Equality. Seems like platinum points outweigh equality in your cabins." The floodgates opened wider. Hundreds of stories poured forth from passengers who'd faced similar treatment. A pregnant woman recalled how she'd been forcibly moved from first class halfway through a transcontinental flight, offered no explanation besides a bland policy. Another man shared how he'd been removed from his fully paid business class seat moments before departure. No refund, no apology, simply replaced by a late arriving VIP passenger. The wave of outrage surged beyond Twitter and TikTok, gaining traction across major media. CNN featured a prime-time segment dissecting the airline's vague response and the deeper implications for racial bias and customer dignity. NPR ran a special episode, The Invisible Passenger, Loyalty Programs and the Cost of Human Dignity. Malik's inbox filled again, this time with interview requests and invitations from television networks, journalists, and influencers wanting his voice. But he declined them all except for one, a personal invitation from the U.S. Department of Transportation. They wanted him to speak at a roundtable addressing airline equity and passenger rights. At the DOT event, seated before airline executives and government officials, Malik wore his usual hoodie and blazer. No theatrics, no anger, just clarity. When his turn came, the room grew still, anticipating outrage. Instead, Malik spoke calmly and deliberately. "I'm not angry," he said, meeting their eyes with quiet resolve. "I'm exhausted. Exhausted from having to justify my existence in spaces I've earned. Exhausted from silence being mistaken for acceptance. But someone needs to say it clearly, before someone else gets erased without a trace." The video of his words immediately went viral, echoing far beyond the conference room walls. It became a rallying call, a moment of quiet truth speaking louder than noise. Malik had not set out to become a voice, but his honest words had begun something that could not easily be silenced again. In the weeks following Malik's quiet stand, Skyreach Airlines scrambled to contain the damage. 4 crew members involved in the incident were swiftly terminated, and Skyreach publicly suspended its loyalty-based reassignment policy. Other airlines, sensing a shift in public tolerance, discreetly followed suit. Southwest and Delta updated their internal guidelines, determined to avoid their own crises. Back in his quiet Denver neighborhood, Malik tried returning to normalcy. But even as routine settled, he felt permanently altered. One evening after dinner, he sat on the porch with his daughter, Nina. At 14, she was observant and thoughtful beyond her years. "Dad," she began softly, eyes thoughtful, "people keep talking about what happened on your flight. At school, they asked why you moved." Malik took a deep breath, considering how to answer her gently without watering down reality. "What did you tell them?" She hesitated, then answered, "That it wasn't right, but you stayed calm anyway." "But why didn't you say something louder?" He smiled gently. "Sometimes, Nina, silence isn't the same as peace. When I stayed calm, it wasn't because I accepted what they did. It was because I wanted people to see clearly what was happening." Nina nodded slowly, her young face thoughtful, absorbing his words carefully. "But they heard you anyway," she said finally, smiling back. "Even though you were quiet." "Yes, they did," Malik agreed, feeling warmth spread in his chest. 2 days later, an email arrived that Malik hadn't expected. It was from an airline ethics coalition, a newly formed task force representing multiple airlines seeking genuine reform. They wanted him to consult on matters of ethics and inclusion, hoping to create systemic change from within. Malik read the email twice, considering carefully. His instinct was caution. He wasn't interested in token gestures or performative promises. Yet something deeper resonated, the idea of reshaping experiences for travelers like him and future passengers like his own children. When Malik finally replied, he agreed, but under one strict condition: Each meeting must start with a true passenger story. Unfiltered, raw exactly as it happened. No gloss, no edits, no corporate spin. They quickly accepted, relieved by his willingness to engage. Sitting back at his desk, Malik felt something quietly shift inside him. He'd never sought the spotlight, yet somehow he'd found himself exactly where he needed to be, using his silence as strength, turning a moment of quiet humiliation into a path toward lasting dignity. Malik Spencer didn't shout. He didn't protest or raise his voice in anger. He sat still, calmly holding space, and that quiet strength echoed louder than words ever could. His silence sparked conversations long overdue, shaking institutions and opening eyes to injustices often overlooked. If you've ever witnessed someone quietly erased in plain sight, ignored, dismissed, or displaced, remember Malik's story. Silence doesn't have to mean acceptance. Sometimes, quiet dignity is exactly what's needed to shift the world. But real change requires your voice too. If this story resonated with you, please speak up. Share Malik's experience with someone who needs to hear it. Help ensure no one is ever erased again. And don't forget to subscribe to H2 Black Thread, where quiet voices have the power to change everything. Because sometimes, sitting still is the most powerful stand you can take.